So you notice in your worship service today that I've interspersed all of James chapter 1 throughout the service. And in James chapter 1, we get a list of proverbs, which we'll begin to study this Sunday and throughout the rest of this sermon series. But the book opens this way. From James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are scattered outside the land of Israel, greetings. So notice James right away starts off, it's a letter to everybody, to those outside of Jerusalem, to those who've been dispersed, to the entire religious community, greetings. James's letter is Catholic in nature then, because it's not addressed to one church or a specific church like maybe Romans or Corinthians as Paul might address, but rather to the entire church. James's letter has been accused of being strawy. In fact, Luther said it has no gospel character to it, and therefore Luther actually didn't prioritize the book of James. Listen to what Luther said about it. I will not have James in my Bible in the number of the proper chief books, but I do not intend thereby to forbid anyone to place and exalt it as he pleases, for there is many a good saying in it. Notice Luther's like, I'm not going to prioritize this book, but there's some good sayings in it. You can see Luther's bias against letters that insinuate faithfulness requires work, not just an actionless faith or a grace, as Luther did prioritize. You see, James isn't really explicit in mention of faith in Jesus. Now, we see Jesus mentioned twice in the letter, and a lot of scholars think that might actually have been added later, and we may talk about that in the coming weeks, but you'll notice there's no real sort of gospel element in terms of belief in Jesus found in the letter. Instead, it promotes a faith in God. It's a more Hebraic or Hebrew reading. There's no preaching on Jesus' death. There's no preaching on Jesus' resurrection. There's no preaching on mercy in store for believers because of their faith. There's no mention of the new covenant, and there's also no mention of God's or Jesus' atoning work. Douglas Moo says this about James's book. The Bible is being translated, commented on, read, studied, preached, and analyzed as never before. But it is questionable whether it is being obeyed to a comparable degree. What Douglas Moo means is that we love to study, we love to ponder, we love to argue about the Bible way more than actually acting out how the Bible commands us to behave and to live. The book of James is an antidote for that. It's practical. James is in your face. It's offensive, and it's truth-telling. Unlike Paul, who was a master theologian, using words like righteousness and justification and sanctification and propitiation and reconciliation and covenant, James's brilliance comes from his call to moral behavior. I would argue James is just as theological as Paul, but it's so much more practical. James is interested in who we're becoming, our behavior, how we act. It's plain and simple. Moo states James's words need to thrust through our theological debates, our personal preconceptions, our spiritual melees, and set us back on the road to a biblical, invigorating, and transforming Christianity. In James 1, we get this beautiful introduction to the rest of the letter. James 1 is sort of this beautiful flowing of proverbs, one after another, one-liner after one-liner. And James 1 summarizes all of the book that's to come. The key words that James uses throughout chapter 1 will be rehashed in chapters 2 through 4. And it's been, James chapter 1, it can be broken into sort of 5 subsections of wisdom. In verses 2 to 4, we get information on life's trials, on the testing of our faith. In verses 5 through 8, God gives wisdom to those who to ask for it in faith. In verses 9 to 11, we learn that poverty can make us trust God more, and wealth isn't going to last. It's like the grass, it's going to go away. In verses 12 to 18, we find out that God is generous, and God gives us a new birth through Jesus. And verses 19 to 27 calls us not just to listen, but to do God's work, and that Jesus has freed us to love God and our neighbor. And we get some incredible one-liners that are the sorts of proverbs that stick with you for your whole life, that you can use for wisdom for your journey of faithfulness for the rest of time. James says this: consider it pure joy when your faith is tested. Consider it pure joy when your faith is tested. To which I say, gee, thanks, James. Thanks. If trials produce endurance, our dear buddy James, we must all have earned an equivalent of a PhD in endurance due to this COVID pandemic. We've all been enduring for months. We've all been in trial for months. James says, consider it pure joy. It's going to produce endurance. Is that really what he means? We'll explore that in the coming weeks. James, later on in chapter 1, spends a good deal of time talking about our tongues and the power that our voice or our words have. I have a confession to make to you. I play a lot of video games, or I should say I used to play a lot of video games. Now my kids play a lot of video games because there's not a whole lot else they can do, and they have to be at home. So when I do get a chance to play, when I do get a seat at the Xbox, I really enjoy it because I sort of feel like I'm in a subversive mode. I'm a pastor, I'm a minister playing with a bunch of people that have no clue what I do for a living. And believe it or not, we talk about real life stuff. It's not like the olden days. In the olden days when I was a kid and I played video games, it was me in my room, or it was me and my brother in our room playing. But now in video games, you're constantly interacting with people. And so in the games you play, you might actually be speaking over a headset to 10, 15 other people also playing the game. And so you can imagine you run into all sorts of situations and circumstances as you're dealing with people on the internet. And so occasionally it comes out that I'm a minister and I get to speak to people's history with the church or faithfulness or lack thereof. And sometimes they ask me questions and it's kind of fun. But what I don't like about video games is how often I hear words used or levied against people. I hear all the time what James is talking about in terms of our tongues, our words. When you play competitive games on the internet, it's common to hear people say, "Oh, you're trash." Or they'll say this: "Imagine thinking you're any good at this game. What's it like to imagine that?" Where I've literally heard this. I've literally heard people say this to each other. "Kill yourself. You're awful at this game." Our words leave terrible wounds upon others. Can anyone today recall something horrible that was said to them, even as a child? I imagine you can. It inflicted that deep of a wound within you. Can you recall a time words were used against you from a family member or a loved one? I imagine you can. Can you recall a time in a classroom where somebody said something biting or harsh? Or in a conference room, or a board meeting, or at your work, or at an assessment or an evaluation of your skills? Have you heard anyone at church say something that was so wounding it hasn't left you? Our tongues, our words are profoundly powerful. Here's the closing words of James's first chapter. Today's just a shotgun approach. It's just the opening. It's just an introduction. But this is how James closes chapter 1 of this great book. If those of you who claim devotion to God don't control what they say, they mislead themselves. Their devotion is worthless. True devotion, the kind that is pure and faultless before God the Father, is this. Awesome. This is great wisdom. True devotion looks like this: to care for orphans and widows in their difficulties, and to keep the world from contaminating us. True devotion to God looks like caring for widows and orphans in their difficulties, and to not be contaminated by the world. This triggers a lot of questions in me. One, is it really that simple? Like, if I really want to be considered a good Christian, all I have to do is care for widows and orphans in their difficulties? That puts me in good standing before God? That's it? What about all the other things we've made Christianity out to be? Sexual purity, don't swear, don't do drugs, theological competence with the big words like atonement and justification and sanctification and the Trinity. What about attending church? What about financially supporting church? What about Bible study? What about all the other stuff we've done for thousands of years? Is it all about the widow and the orphan? Have I been far too concerned with too many other things? Should I stop all that I'm invested in and focus entirely on widows and orphans? And what about the second part? Keep the world from contaminating us. What does that mean? Especially in a time of a pandemic, in a time of COVID-19. What does it mean to keep the world from contaminating us? Am I to be completely separate from the world? Is the world bad? Should I be isolated in a Christian community? A commune? Should Emmanuel invest in a bunker? Should we create the perfect Christian utopia, safe from contamination? How do I know if I'm contaminated? Is there a cure? Is there a test? Is there a vaccine? So friends, as we pore over the book of James for the coming weeks, we'll begin to see the ties he makes, the proverbs he gives, the wisdom he elicits, and to tie those words to Jesus' very words in the Sermon on the Mount. James constantly echoes Jesus' words. And I believe James will become an invitation for us to go deeper in our faith, a faith meant to shape us, to form us, so that we put our entirety of our trust into Jesus. But that, my friends, is going to require action. It's going to require practice. It's going to require participation in Jesus' work. I've included some questions based on all of the main proverbs found throughout chapter 1 of the book of James. And so as we go through James, continue to listen for those echoes from chapter 1 throughout the rest of the chapters. Listen for Jesus' voice and God's gift to us, which is the life abundant through Christ. Amen.